Hey guys.
Hey
buddies.
Hey buddies.
Welcome to the comics Claptrap once again.
I feel like
Very
I'm the only one who
exciting.
keeps asking this, but like, is
How
anyone
many subscribers do we have?
Yeah, how many subscribers are there? Do we have people listening?
We have
Does
a
it
few
matter?
we have a few subscribers,
I thought we thrived though on thinking that no one was listening, and so that we were more comfortable what we were saying, and we were just and it was honest, and
yeah, I mean that's the best. If nobody's listening, that's
nobody's listening.
We're thriving. We're really thriving here.
I'm sure our guest is happy that no one's listening to. I mean,
our guest is like, what am I doing here?
I know exactly. Well, guys, I hope everyone's doing well. And I was excited about listening to our last podcast, our guest list podcast. That was really fun. And I hope that you guys are still working on your comics and reading them. So maybe sometime we'll do another episode of that. But this time we have an actual guest that we're super excited about. We've been meaning to talk to him for like a couple years now. But right now we're excited that he has come out with a new book. It just came out in March, right when we were about to shelter in place. It's called Not a Place to Visit. And it's a collection of comic essays, and they explore social and ecological issues unique to the southwestern U.S. And he dives into things like fracking and drilling, and dealing with the natural resources and the environment, but also talking about stories of his family and their migration through Colorado. And there also is a funny story that deals with a road trip that he had with fellow cartoonist Julia Wirtz, so that it'll be fun to kind of reminisce on that. But also he's just like one of our favorite cartoonists. He comes from our favorite cartoonist town, Portland, Oregon. He's had a fellowship award from the Center of Cartoon Studies. He also made another book, Island of Memory. I think both of them, did they both come from Floating Worlds?
Yes.
Which talks about the German naturalist Georg Wilhelm Steller and his expedition in Alaska. And also my favorite is his comic strip, award-winning comic or nominated comic strip, Service Industry, which has always been my favorite. And so we like to talk about that stuff. And he's just been in various anthologies like Mome and Drawn and Quarterly Showcase, Study Group 12, Best American Comics. Very happy to finally talk to T Edward Bak, Todd Tebbs Bak, about his comics. Thank you. Welcome.
Hey, welcome to the Comics Claptrap.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we just can't see you.
There he is. That's amazing.
What a fantastic intro. That's really nice.
Well, that was all you. That's all your stuff. I just,
that's
find what I can find.
I was like, I don't even remember doing half that stuff.
Todd, I gotta say, you're looking very handsome. This quarantine is doing you well. It's like, I like that little, 8 o'clock shadow there. That's great.
You should have seen it 2 hours ago when it was.
When
it was a 2 o'clock shadow. Or 4 o'clock shadow.
Bak cleaned up just for us.
Well, I had another call and I needed to brush my teeth.
Oh, I see.
Oh.
I see. Just doing us a favor.
You see what's happening.
No, I put on a nice shirt for you guys.
I love that shirt.
Thanks. It's my second shirt, so I had to put it on.
So tell us about the release of your new book. I knew that you were supposed to come out, that the book came out in March and you were going to go on this whirlwind tour for it, and tell us more about it, and also just sort of like how you're dealing with trying to promote it and,
Sure.
all sorts of stuff.
First off, it's really so good to see all of you guys. And I'm really happy to finally get on this show. And finally
before you answer this question, yes, we've been meaning to have Todd on the show for years, right? And
yeah, I was hoping to do some more stuff. I had, right now in July, I'm supposed to be in Luxembourg at a conference.
Wow.
Yeah, I was invited to talk at this conference. It's sort of like water and exploration at the University of Luxembourg.
Wow.
They invited me to come talk about the Steller project.
Very cool.
And then after that, I was going to go directly to France for a residency, this Angoulême residency. So both those things are kind of like on the back burner now. Like the conference has been rescheduled for 2021, and I'm communicating with the residency people and hoping, if things are better later this year or maybe early next year, but it might have to wait until next fall. And I'm not expecting to be finished with this book by then, because it's already been like the second Steller book has already been, like a few years, but I want to talk about that later.
Well, I'm very excited about that. I just reread both these books today, and I forgot how amazing Island of Memory was.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah,
So
and
nice.
we'll talk about it more. But this is just as you were saying it. I guess this isn't based on a true story. I had no idea. so
the latest book. Oh, you mean the Island of Memory?
Yeah, I have no idea. I had no idea who that was. So
you just thought he made him up? Like, wait, what?
That would be pretty cool if I just made it up.
But I love this book, and one of the reasons that the reason I love it, and the reason that I thought it might be fiction, because it feels like when you read it, it feels like a dream, right? It's very like I love. It's hard for me when I read a book where things unfold slowly. I don't know what the heck is happening here, and then as you read, and then things fall into place, and you're like, oh, okay, I see it. But the way Bak writes it and draws it feels like a dream, and it feels like almost like fairy tale-esque, and so that's what gave me that appearance. Like, this guy seems otherworldly to me, so that's why I think I have that. And so one of the things that I wanted to ask you is about how did you decide on like when you were telling this story, how you were going to draw it? Because if you guys haven't seen this, it shifts. Like, it starts off with like kind of a real painterly squares, and then it goes into just like straight up like black and white, and then it gets into colors, and then it gets like I it all works, but I don't understand. To me, it would be baffling to even try to figure out why you did certain things at certain points. Yeah.
Some of the stuff came about very organically, just like decisions. Like, I was like, oh, I wonder if this would work. And you got to remember, like, originally this story appeared in Mome. So I had several issues of Mome to kind of like work out the problems. Like, if you look at the original Mome stuff, this is very different. And there's a lot of stuff that was included in Mome that I excised from this book that just didn't work in the same way that I felt like at first it was very, the presentation was very expository, and it was like, oh, Georg Steller did this in St. Petersburg and blah, blah, blah. And I realized, like, do I want to read this? And I thought, I want to read something more character driven. So it meant I needed to kind of imagine and delve a little bit more into his writing and figure out what was going on and stuff that was written about him later, and people around him, things that were written about the expedition. And I felt like even back then, and I expanded on this idea, or have expanded on this idea for the later work, is that I realized he's sort of the focus, but there's several different stories and it's happening around him. The stuff about his wife is sort of a different story, even though it's related to him later on. In the later work, in this stuff that's coming up, it becomes more actually about her story, her decisions, what was compelling her to stay behind and stuff. So there's things like this, and I'm trying to delve into more like motivation for other characters now that have been introduced in the first book. But also there's other things about that too. As far as like visual ideas, you know, it's cool that you say that about the dream. I did really want it to feel like it had a kind of dream logic to it, to slip in and out of these different visual narratives as the story was kind of building with this stuff. There's a lot of color decisions that I made that reference different time periods. There's like the blue shift and the purple and stuff like this show like different events and different time periods and different places. So that's an idea I wanted to play with as well. And I'm doing that even more in the new work. And also just building up like comics, like straight up black and white comics for different scenes and different episodes. So all these things, it's a lot of layers, and I really want it to be very much a poetic sort of thing, but also it's a challenge because it's like I'm using his narration in a lot of stuff, especially where it's related to animals and botany and everything. So it's like, how do I work this into a poetic narrative? You know, it's a challenge.
For people who haven't read this book yet, which I recommend they do, like, how would you summarize just like the subject and like what was compelling about it and that kind of thing?
Yeah, and why do you want to write about it? Yeah.
It's, you know, it's really interesting, Josh bringing this up, because Josh did the Sea Cow comic like years ago. Mm-hmm. And I remember seeing that, and I think that it must have stayed in my head while I was learning about Steller. Like, but basically, this is the idea was to kind of build a biography of a naturalist. And I was when I started working on this project, I was working in Alaska and on a boat, and I had just finished doing Service Industry, which is like a comic that was like autobiographical. And I thought, I'm going to do a comic that is like service industry, but it's like me working on a boat in Southeast Alaska. And I started putting all my notes together and everything. And then I realized I was learning all this stuff about, you know, Alaskan ecology in Southeast Alaska. And it was really fascinating. And I had like, you know, it's like when you first learn about nature when you're a kid, and it's like everything is like, whoa, unreal. This was like that. Like, and I was like, you know, in my 30s, and I was like really having this like mind-blowing experience being, you know, encountering nature for the first time, like as an adult. And it just like changed my life. You know, I ended up going back to school to study environmental studies for a while after that. But when I learned about Steller and I learned about his relationship with ecology, I mean, they didn't call it that at that time. You know, it was like nature. You know, really, he was what do they call him? A natural philosopher. You know. Anyhow, I learned about his story. I thought it was fascinating. At first, I wasn't even interested in his story. It was Kirikov, who was one of the captains of the expedition. The ships came close to Sitka, and the men there was a crew that were lost. To this day, they still don't know officially what happened. Some say, you know, Tlingit people know what happened, but, you know, because there's no official record, who knows historically? I don't know. Anyway, that stuff was really fascinating to me, and I started learning about the sea lion, learning about the sea cow, learning about the sea otters, and the relationship, you know, with these ecosystems throughout the North Pacific, and then how like the native people were connected, and then how this, you know, this idea of like this Bering land bridge, which is like this idea that people are somewhat familiar with, that the idea that people across the North Pacific are related, from Alaska through the Aleutian chain to Kamchatka and Eastern Siberia and Russia. That idea, actually, the scientific idea, came from Steller. Like, he's the first real like Western science mind to suggest that relationship. And I thought that was pretty fascinating. And the more I learned about him, I was like, oh, he was like the same age that I was when he died, when I like found out about him and was like learning about him. And I had just gone through like this weird relationship where I was just like torn up over it. And I was encountering this nature in Alaska the same time, at pretty much the same age as him. Like I just felt there were some things where I was like, I relate to this character, you know, this person. Even though I, you know, obviously I'm not a scientist, I'm not a botanist, you know, had no experience with that stuff. It was still like a new thing because I was like, it was all new, like learning experience for me.
Mhm.
So I began doing this story from home, and then decided, you know, it was gonna be a larger project, and it's just now it's, you know, been several years, and it's, you know, kind of for a while it was really unwieldy because I was like, look at this.
Yeah,
This stuff here is just like all that stuff is like Russian history, right? You were Alaska
right.
history,
I want
ecology,
to
stuff.
I want to talk about that, the whole thing with the research part of making these books.
Sure.
Like, how do you approach that, and how much do you focus on making sure it's completely accurate, or you know, or there's some room from dramatic license? I mean, it seems like, you know, from the story with the Island of Memory, there is, you know, it is character driven for you, and like Tin said, there's like a dreamlike quality to it. Um, but are there moments that the research side sort of is overwhelming, and how do you deal with that, and how do you kind of organize all that to make it manageable for you?
So I have like finished a lot of art for this second project, and a lot of it is probably just going to go right in the garbage, because I'm like, this is not going to work. You know, like there's stuff here that doesn't work. And I feel like it's just a constant editing process. Like the script has gone through, the script now like has no resemblance to what started as the second book. One of the things, I guess I can talk about this now. I wasn't really going to talk about this at all for a while, but now I'm like more comfortable with it. So when I actually did my own research to go to Unalaska and go out as far as I could in the Aleutians to kind of like just get familiar with the environment and see what that's like, and spent time out there at the same time of year that the expedition had come through. On my way back, I had a really amazing encounter with a native family, Unangan people, whose ancestors would have encountered the Russians that came through there. Maybe not Steller and Bering and all these people, but definitely like people who came afterwards, Baronoff and the missionaries and the seal hunters and fur otter hunters. And they, even refer to themselves as, in English would be like the equivalent of sea lion people. So I had a really incredible encounter and talk with them, and had a really good chance to get to know some of them and spend time with them on the boat coming back on the way back to Homer from Unalaska. And I took really extensive notes about all this, after I'd spent like 2 weeks on Unalaska just exploring the island, or a week, sorry. I don't know if it was 2 weeks. It was like maybe a little over a week. Anyway, I just spent all this time on my own exploring, and it was fantastic. It's incredible environment, so remote. Anyway, had time with this family on the way back and kept these very extensive notes about the dialogue, conversation, everything. And I just figured maybe someday I'll do something with that. I didn't really expect to use it for this project because I wanted it to stay centered in the 18th century. It was very specific, like this is going to be like 18th century, represent this, that's it. Very boxed in, But over time, I realized, like you just did, Rena, like asking me, like, I'm interested in the research of this project. I want to know like what your experience was with it. Yeah. And so many people have asked me about that. And people we know have been like, hey, why don't you include your own story as a part of this? We want to know about this stuff too. That would be cool. And I've just been like, I don't know, like that seems like really just, redirecting the attention on me when I want it to be about this other thing.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, I've realized like there's some real there's a benefit to including this stuff and this information and this conversations I had with these people, and kind of like showing like this is life for them in the wake of what has happened like 200-300 years later, and it's just they're just living out there. And it's just like I wanted to like represent what their lives are like, so there's a balance now, a more balanced story where Native people before didn't get a voice and didn't have an account for what happened back then, but these people were able to address some of this stuff in the encounter and talks that we had. So I decided I want to include all this. So there is stuff about me, stuff about indigenous experience today, and even indigenous experience, like what I could piece together from the accounts for Steller, because Steller spent a lot of time with Koryak people, and they, the interesting thing, the reason it's Sea of Time, I chose the title before I really pieced together how this was going to work, but it turns out like, Steller bearing the expedition on their way back from Alaska, going back to Kamchatka before they shipwrecked, they encountered, Native people in Bird Islands and Shumagon Islands, and on the way to Unalaska, or on the way through Unalaska and the Aleutians, they encountered Native people, Unangan people, at the same time of year that I was going the other direction back to Alaska, back to North America back, through the Aleutians. So it was like that idea of Sea of Time, kind of like that correlation of like meeting, sort of in the North Pacific made sense in that regard. But also because Sea of Time is sort of like expanding this idea of island of memory. So I don't know if I'm answering the question correctly, but I think you're just asking about research and that methodology a little bit.
Because now I'm thinking like now you're adding that one more piece, the autobio piece. I mean that adds a new wrinkle to how you would approach telling the story, and
somewhat
apply maybe adding another challenge too. So I'm wondering how you organize all that. Sorry, Todd.
No.
These are questions I'm actually grappling with too, because I'm working on something that has deals with a lot of research and just trying to figure out, kind of gauge and also balance, making sure it's accurate and that you're representing, you're showing everything, and not hiding certain things, but also you also want to drive the story in some way, but you don't want to, you want to stay true to what is historically accurate. And I'm just curious how you kind of grapple with that in terms of, because I mean it's like you're showing me that you have like a lot of research that you have to go through, and I'm wondering how do you edit. I mean, I think you said that you edit a lot.
There's a lot of editing. I think it helped me to, well, because this stuff is ecologically oriented, that's really the easiest stuff to like figure out. Like it's a matter of like if I'm illustrating stuff that Steller wrote, I have to kind of go through his texts and be like, I have to like look at it and say, is this relevant? Like, is this something that's going to hold the interest? Is it relevant? Is it important? Is it going to hold the interest of the reader? Yeah. And then I'm like, okay, I'll add this. It'll be a part of the illustrated section. So it's like, but then I also have to decide like, how much do I want to put in there? How many pages of this? Like, there's all these plants, so many fucking plants that he like you know, like stuff like that he like found and was like, I'm going to put this in the, you know, in my, you know, he collected all this stuff and named a lot of these plants, names that don't exist anymore because the Linnaean system hadn't been fully incorporated. So they had different like taxonomies, which I think is a fascinating, you know, thing to get into, but it's also like, who, you know, who cares? Like Josh might care.
That's a little insert you could put in there, a mini comic insert, especially
I
for
care.
Josh. Yeah.
But you know what I mean? Like, not a lot of people are going to care about this sort of detail.
Right. Yeah, I think that
So-
that's one thing, like, sorry to interrupt.
No. Go ahead.
But just when I followed this project, just the sheer amount of research you're doing, like you're getting, you're, I mean, you know, traveling to experience the things that might have been experienced by the people in the book. You're digging up texts that, I don't know, maybe nobody has read for 100 years. I mean, like, it seemed like you were doing, like, going after some really an intense level of research that of course then you really do have to edit, right? Like, because there's just so much stuff there, and like you said, like, not all of it is going to help focus your story.
Exactly.
I see your writing with the research and your writing very similar to your art, because like one of the great things about your art that I love, especially in Not a Place to Visit, is how you distill the super detailedness of nature into a very simple and beautiful drawing that like captures the essence of that beauty, you know, but at the same time is not overcomplicated by like, so for me, if I was gonna draw a tree, I'm gonna try to draw every freaking leaf, every freaking thing, because I don't know enough about nature to trust that my simple lines are going to express that beauty. You know what I mean? And so the thing I love about this book, and it's similar to, I guess, John Porcellino too, right? He does the same thing where you see his landscapes are so beautiful, and when you see it, you're like, and your landscapes are so beautiful, and you see it, you're like, I can feel the beauty of this landscape, but yet it's not like you drew every little rock or little mountain, you know, like an amateur person does.
It's like you capture the essence, right? You capture the essence.
And just, the same with your research. You have all this freaking research. How do you whittle that down so that you capture just that essence that makes the story without, you know, having overly complicated and giving me a 700-page graphic novel, right?
Yeah.
So when you draw, how do you decide that? And is it similar process to when you write?
I have a little story. So, and this actually like kind of like related to the sea cow. So I have this, you know, section of this Steller project with this new work. There's a section of the sea cow, and I wanted to like illustrate, you know, several pages where he's like, it's coming, the text comes directly from Steller's, you know, writing about it. So I had to kind of like parse through there and figure out like, what am I going to like take out of here to, you know, to talk about what's the important stuff that he's getting at, what's the stuff that I think is significant, put that in there, write about it, show the animals in their natural habitat and everything. And here's where it got tricky, because I was like, I started thinking about it. I don't know if I want to say I started thinking about it too much, but I started thinking about things like, okay, it's the North Pacific 200 some odd years ago. So the environment's much cooler, and the ecosystem where these animals were, you know, subsisting has probably changed significantly. What do I think that was like? You know, like, I mean, are there animals that are still there? That are animals that are gone? You know, gone. You know, I had to kind of like, at some point, I had to be like, you know what? I'm just gonna have to work with what I know is there now, and like try to like, you know, I had to kind of like imagine some of that stuff and just be like, I gotta put this here. You know, these crabs. We know these crabs are here now, but maybe they weren't there at the time. Maybe there's a different temperature, you know, in the water, you know, stuff like this. Maybe this kelp system is completely different now because of the different types of anemones and like otters feeding on these animals too at the same time. Like, you know, you go through all this stuff and it's like, oh, how much do I want to like commit to this sort of detail?
Mhm.
Basically, you know, I don't want to say I wanted to cut corners. I did as much as I could to figure that kind of stuff out when I was talking about ecosystems that may not be the same as they are today, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is a little bit of stuff that's guesswork, but then it's also like, you know, drawing that stuff and cartooning, which is different than like landscape painting, obviously, is more like a matter of just, I'm familiar with this stuff. I've familiarized myself with this stuff over time. So like drawing it comes a little bit easier, and it's easier to kind of like just work with easier lines and things like this, and representing a conifer to me is the difference between a conifer and, you know, a different, you know, type of tree. A deciduous tree is easier, you know, for me now, and thinking about it and what kind of environment that would be in. It's sort of like shorthand, I guess, is the shorthand drawing for that kind of ecology or that kind of, you know, representation.
Like these two panels right here are just like what I'm talking about here, where over here, they're just so beautiful, you know, in your economy of lines, and but at the same time, it still like captures that kind of breathtaking feeling, you know, and it's just like when you realize that it's just some line, you know, like very sparse lines, it makes it seem like how, you know, that's where you can tell the cartoonist is amazing, right? Like that they can do that without having to like sit there and shade and crosshatch and all that, you know. And I think
but I think it's also like that's the whole thing with comics, is that there's a relationship between the reader and the artist, and that, you know, there is that connection where, you know, you just, they kind of you know, finish your sentence in a way, you know, like you give them these lines, and then it's like impressionistic, I guess, in a way.
Right.
And even talking about that too, I mean, I'm thinking of what Tin was saying, is that I assume, especially when you were traveling a lot, how was your process like? Was it portable? Like, was it like, were you like, you just do all the research and then come back to your drawing table and draw it, or was this all done while you were traveling? Like, I'd be interested to know if that had anything to do with how you drew some of the artwork in that style, or, you know, made certain decisions on style like that based on.
So there was a lot of sketching that I did. You know, and I try to sketch, but, you know, really my process is a writing process. Like I'm always writing. It's always notes and notes and notes and notes. So like when I spend time in Southeast Alaska, when I spend time in Alaska, even when I'm like traveling, you know, on the road or whatever, it's a matter of like quick sketching and sometimes referring to those sketches, but also photography, a lot of like just photographing environments on my own, and writing, you know, and using that as a basis for what I'm doing. One of the things that I felt like I wanted to kind of explore in this project is using the like original artwork from the expedition and a lot of the artwork from the time period as kind of like a foundation for representing environments and representing, like, you know, those kinds of cultural crossroads, stuff from the expedition. So I'm trying to like use original source drawings and original reference drawings in that kind of in the representation of that stuff, rather than going to photographs so much. So I'm working with that idea a lot, except in the case of like the accuracy for, animals, because if you look at some of the original drawings for like things like sea otters and sea cows and stuff, like they didn't even know what the hell they were looking at. So these animals look very strange in those like 18th century, lithographs and stuff. They're bizarre, and they don't look like what we know, a sea lion looks like, or, a seal might look like. I had there's two women that I have worked with who are translators of Steller's journal and journals. It turns out like they just translated the Siberian journal, and they had given me access to this journal like a few years ago because I was, friends with them, and, they were helpful. I met them in Germany. I went to Germany at a conference. It was like a Steller conference, actually. So as a guest, I went to do a talk, and these women, I got to meet them, and I got to talk to them for the first time when the book was published. And they were like, "We love the book. We love it so much." They like took me aside, and I was kind of hoping they would like give me some criticism. And I was like, what needs to happen? And they were like, they took me aside, and they're like, we love it. Everything's great. But these otter tails are just way too long. And I was like, oh my God, they're right. Because otters, like sea otters, like river otters do have longer tails. But the sea otters, their tails are, kind of like, they're not long at all. And I goofed, I really goofed. So I need to go back and fix that stuff. But even
when you said otter tails, I thought you meant like the stories about the otters are too long.
The actual tails
and then
in the drawings.
Do with the actual tails. I got that. Thank you.
Is that nerve-wracking to be working on a book that has like this scholarly audience potentially that's going to like notice every last thing like that?
It used to be, and I had to just reconcile myself to like, I'm like, am I trying to make like a field guide, or am I making some art here,
Right.
So I kind of had to reconcile myself to the art side and just be like, you know what, if there's some egregious error in like characterization or like, some kind of representation of place or whatever, I'm gonna let it go. Where I'm trying to be most accurate is representation of animals and botany, landscapes, maybe, as much as possible, but the cultural artifacts and of the expedition, and also indigenous representation, native people, Koryak people in Kamchatka and in the North Pacific. Like that stuff is the most important for me to get accurate. So I'm really trying to like get that stuff to be as correct as possible. Other stuff like, the way the Russians may talk. Oh, she's wearing the wrong shoes at this thing.
Right.
Or, he doesn't have the right hat for this boat. It's like, oh, that telescope is not right. No.
Right.
So I gotta, fudge a little bit, I guess, or give myself the room to do that if I have to. So, but I am trying to be as accurate as possible, and I've done a good deal of research to demonstrate that. But I also know like somebody will be like, well, this is wrong. No, that's not right. I know I'll have to deal with that. Whatever.
Yeah.
I'll be by that point. I'll be like, hey, you know what? This book is done. Why don't you do a book, and then we'll talk. You do a book.
I mean,
we'll
hopefully, even if it's just like some little thing that they notice, hopefully they appreciate the larger focus on the subject matter that interests them. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think people will, they'll fall asleep reading this book, but then they'll be like, oh, you do a lot of research on it.
Should we talk about Not a Place to Visit?
Sure.
Yeah. There are a bunch of stories. They're tied together because they all deal with ecology and stuff. One of the things that I wanted to ask you is that there are some of the stories are really guided by text. So the writing is super beautiful, and then the drawings are kind of there to basically enhance the text. And then there are some stories here where it's mostly about the drawings and how beautiful that is, and the text is very minimal, like this. When you sit down to do one of these stories, when do you decide that this is a story that I'm going to tell through where the pictures are leading, and then are the stories that you tell that you're like, okay, well, this text, I'm going to do a lot more writing than I'm going to do drawings here. Like, do you sit like that, or is that something that comes organically?
I think it's just a decision that I make as far as like, how's the best way to move this narrative forward? Like, is it going to be moving forward better with a visual element or with a textual element, like the writing? Now, I know I need to incorporate both, but I do have to figure out like, what's the best way forward here? Like, am I going to like, and I know like comics is both, right? So there has to be a synthesis there, but I also have to kind of figure out like, for each panel or each section or whatever, like who's driving, you know what I mean? Like I have to kind of just make that decision. And a lot of times it's just a matter of like, I'm sitting down and I'm drawing the stuff and then putting the text in there and figuring out like, how does the text work here? Like I've got a drawing, what part of the text is going to work well with this drawing? So it does tend to be a little bit more visually oriented as far as like where the text is situated, I guess. But yeah, it's sometimes it's more, a driven, when you look at just for an example of what you're saying, like,
and there's that one story that's really driven by a different fonts and almost looking like poster art or like just and I wanted to know what your motive was for that particular one.
With
title
this,
cut.
Yeah,
not
so,
a place to visit.
So stuff like this, you
Right.
can see like, okay, there's important visual elements here at work that are in color, and it's text. But then there's like, there's visual elements in the same story. The only color elements in this story are the indigenous representations. And I wanted to like kind of like differentiate there in like the sense of like representing like the connection to a natural environment, and that's why I wanted to give the color section to that, to the indigenous experience I was representing. If that makes sense. So in that way, it's kind of like there's a balance of like text and visual ideas at work there, right? Because you're not going to know necessarily what is happening here without the other, right? So I feel like, I work project to project, and like even within a project, like, with Island of Memory, things can differ. Like I may make different decisions even within the project. But with these stories in here, like, each project is a little bit different. Because obviously the last story, the one with Julia, is like more like straight up comics, and that's much different than, they're all comics, but it's much different than a story like this where it's just, one panel per page, right?
Right. Well, I think it's really effective, the like deliberate choices that you make for each story. Like, I think I definitely sensed it as I was reading it. Like, you're telling it in a very specific way that works for the content.
It worked for me, and
Yeah.
I felt like that's what I needed to just kind of like stay within that idea for myself, like just kind of like feel it out and let it be like an organic process. like Tin says, it's just kind of like me feeling my way through it, and trying to stay as true to that as possible.
I feel like even though I love Island of Memories a lot, I feel like when you're looking at not a place to visit, I get the feeling that you're very comfortable in drawing this and writing this. Like there's an easiness to it, and I don't know if that's true. I don't know if it's something that's scrutinized or not. My favorite story in this is the Voices of Celilo Falls.
Celilo, yeah.
Celilo Falls. There's just a real easiness to your style, and there's just a real easiness in your way of telling stories that just seems like it comes out of you, like it kind of just pours out of you in this book. In this book, I love, I still love it, but like it does feel like there's a lot of research and you're editing and doing all these things. When I read this, it just feels very like, I guess what the book's about. It feels very natural. Yeah, and so how much is that is true? Like, is that true, or is that just what it comes across as? Did you feel a lot more comfortable when you're doing these type of stories than when you're trying to do like something long form like the Stellar book?
Well, you got to remember, the Stellar book is really like the first. So I did service industry, but those are strips that I kind of edited and pieced together that made a story that was like took 2 years really of doing like weekly comics. And I knew there was a loose story there that I was trying to get at, and it didn't really even come together completely until like I was done with the strip. So that was sort like ambiguously intentional, if that makes sense. Vaguely intentional. And so what my point is that Stellar was really the first book. Like that was my first like real book. Like the service industry was a collection. I'd done a lot of other stories in anthologies, but Stellar was my first book, and I was like, I knew I was getting towards doing a book. So I realized, after I finished it and started working on the second Stellar book, I was like, do I even know like how to make a book? Like, cause the Stellar stuff was put together from Mome. Service industry came together from a comic strip. And this stuff was because they were essays that I had like been commissioned, to write, and like it was stuff that I was like specifically interested in doing as a short piece. And like I did actually, I don't remember when I made a decision. I think it was like actually around the time that I was working on the fracking one. I was like, it would be really kind of interesting to do this as a series of stuff that was based in Western North America. And I honestly, like, this may just be like the first of a series of these kinds of books, because that's what my original idea was, like, do it as a series of these things. And so I thought, well, I could keep doing that, as like these kinds of, collections about stories in the Western North America. So I would like to do more like that. But I also felt like by doing this, it was a way to get me more comfortable with like a certain type of research, being able to focus on the research, being able to hone everything in. And this was like it came in between the two Stellar books for a reason, because I really needed to learn how to focus on my research and like hone in on the stuff that works. And this book helped me do that. And like figuring all the stuff out in here helped me do that in order to make this second Stellar book better. If that makes sense.
So what are the things that you think helped you in the Steller books?
Well, it's just like how I was saying earlier. Like you I had a lot of editorial assistance on each of the projects in here. I had, you know, Brian Calvert with High Country News helped me. Ellery May Harris helped me. Trevor helped me. Trevor was supposed to be the editor for this story with Julia, which was going to be a Popula, you know, piece. Trevor helped me with the Not a Place to Visit essay. And I needed a strong editorial guide with the work in here. With Ellery, the piece that Ellery May Harris helped me with, like it was, I don't want to say it was a mess, but there was a lot of stuff that she really helped me like see that I was not able to figure out. So having a good editorial hand there to guide me through that stuff helped me see like what was the kinds of things that people were going to be reading. What are they looking for? What does the editor need from me? And also I felt like it was stuff that I needed to develop in myself. And specifically, I think the idea came to me that I wanted to be a better cartoonist at the end of this book. And cartooning, you know, means you have to like pare a lot of things down, really. It's like you're getting at this essential form. And if you look at, you know, that first piece, these are, you know, pretty much chronologically done. I mean, it's nice to look at. I enjoy looking at this stuff, but it's also like very busy, you know.
Yeah.
A lot of the color is nice, but it's also like, you know, this would function without it, you know. I mean, it's pretty. I mean, it's nice to look at, but it's also like, well, you know, it's more illustrative in a way, right? So
one of the things that I want to get into a little bit more of your backstory, because I even though we are friends and we've hung out before, I really don't know very much about you. The one thing I do know about you is you're a rambling man, because there was a time that I was like, I don't know where Bak's living. I think he's in Georgia, maybe he's in Alaska. And this book is all about the Northwest, and you are right now in the Northwest, right?
I think it was more like the Southwest, wasn't it?
It's both.
Right now,
or both. Oh, okay.
it's like,
how important is it to be in the area that you're writing about? Like, how important was it to be in Oregon while you're writing about the Northwestern America in this? Could you have done this book if you were somewhere else?
No, I don't think I could have. I don't know what it is. I can't really figure that out. You're not the first person to ask me this. But for me, I feel like there's something about being, spending time in like geographically, that I feel like I need to do to like connect with a story there. I can't explain that really. I mean, it may come from like an element in this book about the fracking. You know, when I was a kid, I wrote about, you know, spending time on the well with my stepdad. Like there's this scene with me here, like as a kid, and you know, I remember traveling around, you know, with him quite a bit during the summer. He's a geologist and mudlogger, and I remember there was a lot of times where I was like, I got to remember this, you know what I mean? But we were always in these like weird remote places, like in the Southwest, or, you know, those experiences really kind of helped fuel my curiosity about moving around and about like seeing, you know, Arizona, Utah, like the Western states, and, you know, really help me understand the beauty of those places, and kind of help me understand like the history of my family and their connection to Southern Colorado. And, you know, they'd come up from Mexico, they'd settled in the San Luis Valley. This is my mom's family, you know. And then they came up to Denver. So, you know, my family's connection to that region was like really something that helped kind of anchor my interest to all that stuff, and kind of, you know, built it up that way too. I talk a lot about this in Sea of Time, actually. I felt like it was something, you know, this is really, it's really, I don't want to say it's weird. It's complicated. It's so complicated because I have to be very cautious about this. My great grandmother, you know, my great grandparents were would refer to themselves as Indian this or Ute this or Navajo that, you know, but we don't know for sure because we don't have I don't have a tribal connection. You know, I can't claim that stuff legitimately. I don't have a cultural experience with Native American cultures. Maybe, you know, at some point, and that the history of that area, the St. Louis Valley, is really weird and complicated in and of itself because of the settlement history there. People were granted land by the Mexican government. It wasn't part of the U.S. when my mom's family got there. And now it's Southern Colorado, you know, so it's a complicated like history there. And for me, when I, you know, encountered indigenous people in the North Pacific, you know, I wasn't, on some level, I was thinking about that, but I wasn't consciously diving into that stuff until much later when I started going back over some of that research. And something that I felt like I wanted to address in the work going forward with Steller was that I wanted to go in a direction that sort of embraced rather than like sidelined the indigenous experience with violence. And I felt like and like cultural devastation there. And I think that was really important for me to get to that point and see that. And I realized that like depicting violence towards those people is the same thing as kind of like sharing videos of cops, like, you know, killing black people, you know. It can be, you know what I mean? Like, especially where it's like indigenous people are concerned. So I really feel like with, you know, pop culture, there's a lot of like, you know, pathologically, you know, nihilistic violence that we sort of see it as like violence as novelty, right? And I think comics can sometimes be guilty of like perpetuating that and upholding this stuff as like a sort of a code. And I felt like I have a responsibility to reconsider all that stuff. So I need to think about like, what kind of cultural violence am I committing? Or, you know, I have to think about ways to positively, you know, represent these sorts of like ideas in a cultural context, if that makes sense. I don't know if that,
Yeah.
if what I'm making.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense, especially to the context of what's going on now. You know,
Yeah.
I think it's great that you're conscientious of it. I think that's you know, that's the most important things, to be conscientious of and sensitive to a lot of these stories, you know, especially because they're not ours. You know, writing stories that are of others is something that we constantly have to like look inward to see. So I'm glad. I knew that you were, when you read these stories, you have that feeling that you even though, you know, you're telling their story in a very respectful way, you know. So it is also nice to hear that your process, that you actually are thinking about that quite a bit, though.
You know, what's really interesting was I had spent time with this, you know, family in the Aleutians, and it's been like several years. And after a long time of kind of like going over this in my mind, I was like, I really need to include this stuff in the story. And I told, you know, them that I was working on this project at the time, and, you know, they were, I don't want to say they were thrilled about it. They were interested in what I was doing. But I, wanted them to understand, that I got the idea of the cultural violence. But what I realized was like, I need to make sure that it's okay for me to share what they shared with me. So a few months ago, I actually like wrote to like an administration out in the borough out there. And I was like, hey, I told them, I was like, I encountered this family like years ago. And I sort of described them and kind of like, I had some of their names and stuff. And like literally like, I think it was like 24 hours later, like I got a message from one of the women that I had talked with out there. And
Wow.
she was like, oh yeah, that guy's my brother, the guy you're describing. And I was like, and I remembered her, I had written her husband's name, her name and all their names and everything down and everything they'd wrote or said to me and stuff. And she's been so helpful. And I've been like, I want to make sure that I'm doing this in the most respectful and in the best way to kind of like show like, I don't want to be like, here are these poor people that were almost wiped out. I want to be like, you know what? These people are still alive. They still are here. This is their lives. This is what happened, but this is how life is now. And I think that's what they want as far as like my representation too. So we're still actually communicating, and I want to make sure that stuff comes across. And it's also, for me, it was also like an investigation for myself, because like there was a feeling of connection, a reconnection with nature when I went out there, that I recognized. And I think one of the things that I considered after that was how comics became sort of for lack of a better word, sort of a spiritual practice for me in a way. And I wanted to explore that in ways, and I talked with some other people about it. And I think, Rena, you might appreciate this too, especially because I was reading recently about like indigenous dance traditions and how there's like this idea about like performance as a kind of ritual link to tradition and ancestry and forms and the individual in the community, and I think creating comics contains forms of ritual and tradition, and we're all kind of creating our own sort of like picture story medicine, in a way. And I think it's worth considering when we're like brewing up like our own snake oil. We have to sort of look at like whether those ingredients are toxic or helpful or things like this. So obviously like superhero books and YA books are a little different, that mindset, but I'm trying to create something for, I guess, for everybody, but also like I want you to be able to look at this when you're a kid and see something, and then look at it later when you're an adult and see something else too. Hopefully, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about another story, but I feel like that's like a really good way to encapsulate like what your book, the idea behind this book is, and I just love that whole thing. And I wanted to get into just sort of the story at the end with Julia and sort of Julia Wirtz, and just sort of going back to kind of doing autobio. And what was the motivation on trying to talk about the Salton Sea, but in a autobio type of format instead of just sort of like a documentary type thing specific to that.
In a nutshell, it's a little more interesting, isn't it? Like when you get to that part, it's like you're like finding out about like, oh, there's these birds, there's weird mud volcanoes and like all this stuff. But then it's also like you get this introduction to these two, like,
Yeah. There's almost like a commentary at the end about like, this, the human quality of these.
It's kind of like I wanted to have something to say about like humans in the environment. Like here's humans moving through the environment, existing in the environment, maybe not connected to the environment in a
like ruining the environment and ruining yourself from the environment.
Right.
Putting your leg in a
or not maybe
sludge.
not in a meaningful like traditional way, but also, you know, sort of like acknowledging that, and also you know, kind of like feeling your way through it, you know, through the environment. And oh, here's this weird owl, here's like, you know, there's, you know, this characterization of people existing and moving through the environment. And I felt like these, you know, this stuff, like this is kind of chronological, you know, like that story is last in the work, and it was the last one that I drew, and these other ones sort of built up. I think the only one that's kind of out of place is the Voices from Celilo Falls, which was probably the first piece like this that I did. That one, you know, I should mention that I didn't write that. I kind of edited it, but Sarah Merck was really, she really put that together. She was the writer and edited like a series called the Oregon History Comics that this was a part of originally. And Sarah did, you know, stuff with, I think Nicole Georges did one. A lot of Oregon-based cartoonists did these stories that Sarah wrote. Sarah and I worked really closely on this, and I kind of helped her edit things. She gave me some prompts for illustrating, but I, you know, did my own research and found the best way forward as far as the visual narrative there. Was I saying? Oh, so with Julia, like that being the last story, you can tell it's a little different, you know, from the other, like narratively, and also like the character kind of like stuff is obviously different. And moving forward into the next Steller book, that book is definitely more along the lines of like a characterized thing, even more so than Island of Memory, which is, I mean, the characters are not really well defined in that book, but in the book going forward, I think you can see like, you know who this is and stuff. But yeah, with this, I thought Julia is like a good friend. We had done, you know, a trip before in Pennsylvania like years ago, and really had a great time. And I loved driving around with her, and we would just, you know, shoot the shit and like drive all over and stuff. And we both wanted to see the Salton Sea, so we went down there and had a blast and just explored, you know. And you know, she hollered at me because I wouldn't make up my mind about eating lunch and stuff. But yeah, we had a great time. It was fun. And I wanted to convey the sense that like, hey, here's a couple friends, you know, there's no, you know, we're just like exploring this area because it's fascinating. And I also wanted to like talk about like what is so interesting about it, you know. And so it was an easy way, like having characters was an easy way to sort of move through that environment and introduce like different ideas about it.
So one last question. I don't know if you have any more questions, but what so the next book you're working on is the second book to the Steller book. And did you say that you were going to put yourself in there? So I'm wondering, is that what's going to come from this book, and then, you know, flowing into the second one, putting more of yourself in there and adding more commentary? Is that the approach?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the second book, I want to talk about it. I'm really excited about it.
Do you not want to talk about it? Oh, you want to talk about it?
I do want to, but I also am like, what am I going to give away? But I, you know, it's like,
you don't have to give away anything.
It's not like you're seeing anything yet. So the idea is that there's several different sort of like movements in the work where it's Steller, you know, is traveling point A to point B. You know, he gets to, there's different locales. Like it shows his experience in Kamchatka with Koryaks. There's a Koryak character whose name comes from an actual person that was mentioned in a book with someone that Steller worked with. So this character came about as a guide, which they know, we know like they had to count on these guides to get through the environment. So that was, for me, that was like someone that was like really important to represent in the narrative, and like someone that Steller was, Steller was obviously close with the native people. So there would have been someone that he counted on for this stuff. So representing that, representing other people, him in Kamchatka, him meeting, like you get to, there's an introduction of him with Bering and other important people in this expedition. There's the introduction of the conflict that occurs with a character who really caused all the problems that transpired. Which happened, and Steller writes about this. And there's his encounters in Alaska, like going ashore, like exploring. That's a big section that's like, really, I'm looking forward to finishing all that. And then on the way back, like we know that they were shipwrecked. That's Island of Memory. So it's kind of like the story jumps forward, backwards and forth. And there's even like a continuation of Island of Memory, a section of that that goes in, that's in the same style, as this stuff. But interspersed with all these geographical sections are stories about my experience and how I came to be like out there, what brought me out there, why am I interested in this stuff? And it goes back to a lot of things for me, experiencing stuff as a kid that made me want to like get out in the world, like to stuff that it was like, when I was a kid, I was really obsessed with, I realized this later, like I was like really obsessed with like weird marooned narratives somehow. And I think that on some level I felt that way. I felt kind of like abandoned, or not abandoned, but stuck and marooned, and I had to get out, it's like Gilligan's Island was a huge thing for me, Robinson Crusoe, Planet of the Apes was a huge deal. Just all those kind of, like, what was that? When I saw that Tom Hanks movie, I was just like, oh my God, like it blew my mind.
Wow.
Castaway, and that was when I was an adult even, but I was still like, all those kinds of stories just always like, oh, wow. Like I didn't care about Survivor because that stuff was like, that was like a soap opera. And like, I knew there were like, it was a documentary, like to me, it was more interesting that people had been marooned and like survived, somehow. To me, those kinds of stories were really fascinating. And I found out, this is really weird, but I'm going to tell you about this because I sort of talk about it in the book. But so you guys might know this story already, but so the story of Robinson Crusoe comes from a real life incident with a sailor named Alexander Selkirk, who they think was Alexander Selkirk, who was marooned on an island off the coast of like South America. And he was set ashore because he had a problem with the captain, and the captain was just like, they were like, F you, bye. So he went ashore, and he was like, but he was also like, the reason Selkirk left was because he actually like didn't want to sail with them because he thought the boat was not seaworthy. He thought the boat was having a problem. He was like, I don't trust you as a captain, and I don't trust this vessel. And the captain was like, bye, so they left him there. And then later picked him up. Like, I think he survived there by himself, isolated for like, 3 years or something. They picked him up, brought him back. He made it back to England. He apparently met Daniel Defoe, or Daniel Defoe heard the story and then wrote Robinson Crusoe. Now, the crazy thing about this story is that the captain who put Selkirk on the island was this crazy like British privateer pirate guy who's also like a naturalist. He was also kind of like, he was interested in, you know, nature and would write about it, and was like, he was actually the first person to write about the sea cow, which he called the manatee. And this guy's name was Dampier. He's William Dampier, a British, you know, privateer guy. He wrote about this stuff, and Steller knew who Dampier was. Like, he didn't know him personally because he was already dead. It was like before Steller, but Steller referred to Dampier's works. And then even in his, like, Josh, you probably know, like, he like knew about the sea cow because of Dampier. But Dampier was writing about the manatee, like in the equatorial regions, you know, and Steller thought it was the same animal. So anyhow, this has actually been really fun.
Yeah.
You know, because I've never done an interview like this ever.
No.
So like, this was the one where I was like, okay, like if I'm going to do any kind of podcast thing, it's going to be with you guys. So I'm glad
and then next week you're gonna do it with Noah Van Sky. We know what's happening.
Hey,
yeah, we're a good place to try out since nobody watches, so you can work out the kinks.
This is like our workshop. It's your workshop for interviews. So yes,
cool.
This is the out of town, off Broadway. You know,
right?
Yes,
but it was long overdue.
It was.
Yeah.
It was.
I wanted to say one thing with Tim though.
Yes.
When he was talking about like discipline, like I used to get up first thing in the morning and it was like, bam, I'm just like going at it. And like, I would have my coffee, like even before I'd eat anything, it was like, I had coffee first thing in the morning, coffee, drawing, and that's it for like at least 2 hours, take a break, and then I go back to it. And I used to be pretty good about that. And in like 2014, like after Island of Memory was published, I was like slack ass. And it's been 6 years since I have been that productive every day. And I want to get back to it for sure. Like I would love to just be like, okay, like same old routine, but I lived a completely different life too. Like I know I can do it. But I think
it's also age. Like things just take us longer, not only because we're old, but also because we're more we're also more like cognizant of what we're doing. Whereas like we talked a lot about this with Chuck Forsman, where like when you were younger, you just throw out that comic. It didn't really matter because it's just zines and you're selling it on to your friends. And now all of a sudden there's all this pressure. Like you probably have this pressure, like the people that you're writing about are going to read this. The people that are into this is going to read this. The people that have read the other one's going to read this. And it's got to be as good or better and all that and all that pressure, I think, makes you unpredictable.
Or also maybe we're making just more interesting stories now. Because the stories we used to make were like, you know, throwaway stories. Like,
totally.
And so now we're really committed to making sure we're telling it the right way.
I think it's just a matter of growth. Like, you know, it's not like, oh, these stories that I told earlier were just throwaways, like, or maybe they were, but at the time they probably didn't seem like that. You know, they probably seemed like, oh, you know, this is, I mean, I don't think like, I mean, I feel like there was a little bit of like consciousness on my part with this new book that I was doing it with a kind of like I was putting these together. There was sort of a goal of being like, all right, I want this stuff to help me get to the next project. You know, there was a little bit of consciousness of that. I don't think there was a lot of that when I was younger. I think that I just was like, I'm doing this thing. I care about it. I'm passionate about it. I'm going to like stick to my guns and do it. And now it's just like my interest is, I feel confident enough that I've like grown as a cartoonist, but now I want to like grow within that even, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, I want to keep growing, but I think it's growth in a different way, maybe. But you know, like Rena, like you're the same, it's the same with you. Like your storytelling chops, like, you know, have grown, like your work has like developed, like all of us.
I hope so.
Yeah. All of us all of us have like grown as
You
storytellers
see
and
Tim's face.
artists. If you're doing this stuff, like you just naturally, it's like you learn by doing, you know.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think as you do it more, you know, it doesn't become less meaningful, and if it, you know, it's or at least the process of it, I feel like doesn't become less meaningful. I guess is what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I don't know if that is it. Do you guys agree?
I agree with that. Mm-hmm.
I do.
I do.
I'm not trying to be the authority. I'm just saying like that's how I feel.
There's some parts of me that don't think I'll ever be as good as I was when I was you know, when I was starting out. I mean, it came so easy. Like stories just came so easy back then, and comics came so easy. Like it just kind of came out of you, and now it's just harder to do, you know. And I'm worried. Yeah. But you know,
what do you think the difference is? Like why do you think it's more challenging now?
I mean, that's it. Mainly just because that I'm always second guessing myself. I'm always like, you know, I think the pressure of like producing something that is substantial is really
I mean, do you feel like you value it more? I mean, I maybe that's it. That, you know, before it was like, oh, you know, but I think you've come to appreciate, you know, the form, because this is what you know we've done for a long time. And
but also I think the quarantine comics you were doing though were probably like maybe the most thoughtful comics you've ever done. You know, like, and so that's harder. It's harder to be thoughtful.
Yeah, but I mean, it's also the reason I was able to do that, I think, was because, I had this feeling that, like, it's just a daily thing I'm just going to put on Instagram. It's not like this big novel, you know? So I have to get myself into that mindset where it's not like, I think another thing is the education that we've had. Like, I know, like Matt Madden, I know like 550 ways to tell a story now, like in a panel, you know? And that can be sometimes crippling, because when I was a kid, I only knew one way, you know, I only had one vision of what the next panel could be. And now I'm like, well, I could have done this, or I could go back in time and then do this, and then maybe I could do this and spin it back around. And now that all that kind of stuff is debilitating to me, you know. But like I said, I think this is going to be the year I'm going to break through, you know, and I'm going to work, because I feel like this is our time. I was telling Rita, this is our time.
This is our time.
And we gotta take it. If we don't
by the balls.
Pass this up.
I'm inspired. It's inspiring to hear you say that.
Put to work, you guys. Let's get out of this work.
Right. Let's do it.
So here, like, let me just say before we go, so these two books that we talked about, Island of Memory and Not a Place to Visit, were both published by Floating World. And they also publish lots of other pretty cool comics.
Yeah, Floating World. And I'm at tedwardbak.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Todd Edward Bak. And yeah, thank you so much, you guys. It's been really.
We're so happy that we were finally able to talk to you, and congratulations on the book. And we'll see you soon.
Hope
buddy.
so. I'm gonna come hang out in Oakland soon.
Yeah. Awesome.
Right. Love you
All
guys.
Right. Thank you guys. Okay.